Functions basically are the modules which are block, and block have the names. Functions are basically we normally use when we return a single value. Function mostly takes the arguments as in argument, and these in arguments are basically used as the in parameters. Based on in parameters, functions return single value. तो फंक्शन के पॉइंट ऑफ व्यू से जो सिंगल वैल्यू हमारे पास आती है वो वैल्यू हम रिटर्न करते हैं, और जब फंक्शन को एग्जीक्यूट किया जाता है तो वो वैल्यू असाइन की जाती है किसी दूसरे वेरिएबल को, और फिर उसको यूटिलाइज किया जाता है. In this particular module, we will discuss compiling and executing of the function. So basically executing of the function का मतलब ये है कि फंक्शन को किसी वेरिएबल के असाइन किया जाता है और किसी दूसरे प्रोसीजर मॉड्यूल या किसी और फंक्शन में उसको कॉल किया जाता है. और फिर हम इसके बाद जो एक्सरसाइज 1 और एक्सरसाइज 2 करेंगे, जिसमें वेरियस एस्पेक्ट्स पे हम हाईलाइट करेंगे. As we mentioned earlier, that set server output on we normally mention, and function value like for example 3477 is a parameter, and this particular parameter is normally utilized and putting in front of the variable, and then later on we can use the variable for the further purposes. So let's suppose in exercise 1 we will use function, and this function is basically used to calculate the maximum salary, and this maximum salary using the aggregate function. This aggregate function is normally used as a other aggregate functions such as min, max, average or something. So we normally give the parameter value, which is the argument, as a department number. So within one department, like for example department number 10, who is taking the highest salary. But we are not using who is taking highest salary, but we are just showing the maximum salary taken by someone. So in this particular case, we return this single value as a return value, which is a number. So the return of this value is basically called number. So this is why we mention the return value. So data type of the return value is very important. We use the SQL ERM function to see that whether we are getting the standard SQL error or not. So in this particular case, we mention this SQL ERM to find the or to see the defined error. Let's suppose we execute this function by putting in front of variable in another block. So this is another block or another maybe procedure or function where we call this function as a calling function and assign this function in front of the variable. And then later on we will display this maximum salary, and we can hide this we can display this salary as a highest salary, and calling from block, which is basically called the dbms underscore output dot put underscore line of the calling block. Let's see example number 2. So in this particular example we are finding the factorial. So this is a recursive kind of function. So we are doing a recursive programming in this particular example. For example, we have a function called fact, and we are taking the single variable as a parameter in. So we should say that for x equal to 0, the factorial is 1. For rest of them we say x into a fact of x minus 1. So it will return a single f, which is a factorial value. Now we have to execute this function. We are not going to execute this function just like procedure, but we normally call this function by putting in front of some variable. So let's suppose we define a variable called factorial in another separate module. So this is another module and this is another module. So this module is called calling module, and this module is called called module. So these are the two modules basically normally we use. So these modules basically calling the other one. Let's suppose we want to find out the fixed value of, although we can do this one by putting the in parameter, or we can define as an input variable, and based on this one the factorial will calculate, and our output will show the factorial of 6 is 720, and which is the correct one. So this is how we can call the calling module. This is how we can say the called module, and based on this module, we ultimately find out the factorial of input number. In this particular case, it is 6, which is basically 720.